Now, debanking. Remember that? When Nigel Farage had his bank account closed by NatWest, then it turns out thousands of regular folk had similar experiences. Well, the scandal promoted the government to take action, and they promised back in March to change the rules to make it harder for banks to shut down accounts for political reasons. But was all that simply hot air? The rule changes have been lost in a process known as wash-up, the hasty passage or ditching of legislation ahead of the dissolution of Parliament before an election. Well, Toby Young is here and he says that the government is still failing us over debanking. Toby, you have campaigned hard on this. This is an issue that seems to have just got lost in the melee.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the casualties of the snap election. The Free Speech Union, the organisation I run, got debanked back in 2022. We fought back and managed to get PayPal to restore our account, but we thought, well, this is obviously not just happening to us. So we then embarked on a long campaign to persuade the Treasury to change the payment services regulations to make it more difficult for banks and payment processors like PayPal to debank individuals, companies, organisations for political reasons. And we actually made some headway. And then when Nigel's issue blew up and it turned out he'd been debanked by Coutts, the government thought, well, we'll have to act. And so they agreed to change these regulations to make debanking not impossible, but a bit more difficult. The Treasury Minister that we were dealing with and we developed a good relationship with, he was reshuffled last year. But he said, at the time I was reshuffled, it was all ready to go. And then the Treasury published a draft version of the statutory instrument.
This secondary legislation, Henry VIII powers, sometimes known as.
Secondary legislation that would have enabled the government to make these changes to the payment services regulations. It was all agreed, the draft had been written, and it was going to be laid.
These things are just nodded through Parliament, usually.
Yeah, there's very little, there's no debate, there's no opportunity to amend them, so it was a done deal. But they just didn't have time to lay the statutory instrument before the dissolution of Parliament. So it's fallen by the wayside. I mean, I don't think it was deliberate malfeasance by the government. I think it was just one of many things they were genuinely planning to do that got lost in the wash-up, as you say.
Now, of course, you and the Free Speech Union and many campaigners built relationships with the Conservative ministers who were drawing up this legislation ready to go. Obviously, if we're to believe the polls, unless there is the most monumental polling error unseen before in the history of Western democracy, there will be a Labour government in 3 weeks' time. Have you made inroads with likely Treasury ministers, with Rachel Reeves' team? How optimistic are you about this going forward?
Not terribly optimistic. We started a petition at the Free Speech Union to try and urge all the political parties to include a commitment to seeing this through in their manifestos. And it's not a partisan issue. Anyone can be debanked. It isn't just people on the right that it affects. Some far left groups have been debanked as well. It affects Muslims. The Muslim charities often find themselves debanked. Finsbury Park Mosque got into difficulty with its banking facilities. My hope is that the best way of persuading the Labour Party to embrace this policy and see through these changes, and they didn't oppose them in Parliament. There was cross-party consensus that this needed to happen. We don't want a Chinese-style social credit system in our country.
In some ways, it's perhaps more aligned with the Labour Party's values. After all, you're telling businesses that they can't operate their business in the way that they would choose.
Yes, the reason I hold out a smidgen of hope is that because the Labour Party is terrified of losing votes to Muslim candidates in various constituencies where the Muslim vote, this new organisation, is fielding candidates against the Labour candidate and has made this list of 14 demands it wants the Labour Party to meet before it'll withdraw these candidates. Well, it obviously can't meet all 14 of these demands, but if they added a 15th, see through these amendments to the payment services regulations to make it more difficult for us, amongst others, to be debanked, then that might enable the Labour Party to claw back some of these votes it might lose to Muslims who are concerned about this issue as well as many other issues.
Amendments to the payment regulations, it doesn't sound like the most populist charge in the world, but somehow it has become a large political issue.
I think with Muslims, they're aware of this, and they do care about it. And if they can be persuaded to add it to their list of things they want the Labour Party to prioritise when they get into office. I mean, it wouldn't be that big a price. It's not like, breaking off military relations with Israel. It wouldn't be that big a price for Keir Starmer to pay.
Something that was going to happen anyway.
It was something that was going to happen anyway, and the Labour Party hadn't opposed. But if people want to sign our Free Speech Union petition, if they search for change.org and debanking, they'll find it. And the more signatures we can get, the more pressure we can put on the Labour Party and the other parties to actually see this through, whatever the outcome of the election.